The first time I came here to the Society was back in the late 70s when I heard Dane Rudhyar, who's a very famous astrologer, talking right there in this room. And it was a great privilege to meet him, in which he talked about, I realize today, some of the same things that I'm talking about here tonight, which has to do with collective patterns and the zeitgeist in a sense. And let me begin with an anecdote of about 20 years ago or so when I was working on the staff of the Quest magazine. We were under, Bill Metzger and I were under a very heavy deadline, and there had been problems with the printer, and we had one delay after another, and the stress was getting to us. And finally, when we were getting to the end of the line with the magazine, with this newest issue, I had the impulse to get away, and I wanted to just drive off somewhere and just have a few days to clear my head. And I remembered back to a place I had read about several years before in South Dakota called Bear Butte. And it's a Native American site that was very sacred to the Native Americans for centuries, where Sitting Bull and others would go to have vision quests, and it's still in use to this day by the Native Americans in that region. And so I got in the car, and I had maybe a day or two planning, and I drove all the way there nonstop, and maybe stopping for a few hours. And I got there, I spent some time on this site. I hiked up the mountain there, and there were other people. You could see them doing their vision quest in their tents and all this. And came back down, spent maybe 4 days on this trip, a very short little trip because I had to get back to work, and I had a day or two off. And I got back here, and then it turned out in the next week or so after I had returned to the Theosophical Society, I had been speaking to various people who worked here, including Tim Boyd. I seem to remember the president. I discovered that 3 other people had gone to Bear Butte that same weekend as myself, and I hadn't crossed paths with any of them. It was strictly quote-unquote coincidence that we all decided to go to this place. And the irony of that is that it's not far from the Devil's Tower, which is where Close Encounters was, where people are drawn to a place. And aside from the fact that it was just so odd that several other people had gone there and none of us crossed paths with each other, I thought, and I've had this sort of thing happen a lot, where I'll have an idea and then I'll discover somebody else had the same idea around the same time, or I'll want to go somewhere and I'll find someone else there that was drawn to that area. And it makes you wonder about the nature of thoughts, in terms of are our thoughts our own, or is there some kind of mental atmosphere and we're drawing from those thoughts, like radio receivers drawing off of radio stations. And you see this in history a lot with inventions, for example. Like I was reading today, in fact, that Edison came up with the light bulb, the incandescent light bulb, around the same time as somebody else who shortly after. Or you look at in science, Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace came up with a very, very similar theory of evolution around the same time. And calculus was conceived by both Newton and Leibniz around the same point. You look at music. I remember an interview with Paul Simon, the songwriter, many years ago, where he mentioned how odd it was that when he wrote Bridge Over Troubled Waters, which was a very unusual song for that time, it was not typical, that kind of religious, quasi-religious sort of song. And then the Beatles came out with Let It Be, and he said that was kind of an unusual sort of coincidence that they were released at the same time, because neither knew, even though they were friends, they didn't know that the other had been writing that sort of thing, that kind of music. And they were both unusual, both unorthodox for that period in terms of popular music. Politics, you see that a lot with, my friend Richard Tarnas pointed out how at the same time that we saw the mutiny on the Bounty was when the French Revolution was taking place. And they were both fairly unprecedented sort of things within their own context. And there was no way for the people on the Bounty, the crew on the Bounty, to know what was happening in France. And so there was this independent sort of rebellious spirit. In the 1960s, you saw, I remember Joseph Campbell years ago talking about how odd it was that in the mid-60s you suddenly saw these kind of cultural uprisings all over the world. that were seemingly disconnected. You know, China even with the Cultural Revolution, and America and Europe and South America, all these, suddenly these energies sprout up. And you could go on with examples like this endlessly in terms of history and these sorts of coincidences. And as astrologers, we have a little bit of a leg up on this sort of phenomena because we can understand the archetypal patterns that are driving these sorts of movements, these sorts of trends. So for example, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but the mutiny on the Bounty and the French Revolution both occurred when there was a very powerful pattern of Uranus opposing Pluto, for example, which is something we got going on now, which I'll get to in a little bit, very similar, square to Pluto. And so we can identify and even to a certain extent predict when these sorts of parallel developments are going to come up, if you understand the symbolism of those sorts of things. And the term zeitgeist is one that philosophers use. It's usually translated to mean the spirit of the age, Z-E-I-T-G-E-I-S-T, if I'm right. And the spirit of the age refers to this idea that different periods in history have certain qualities, have certain textures, certain meanings, you might say. And you could take it one step farther and talk about on an esoteric dimension in terms of it's almost like different periods have a certain mental atmosphere and they're conducive to certain kinds of thoughts, certain kinds of feelings. And so when you see a shift in the zeitgeist, certain inventions will tend to come up, or certain kinds of music, or certain kinds of independent political movements around the world. And in particular, astrologers look to what they call the generational planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. It's not just those three. But the outer planets, the slow-moving planets, are the ones that are most related to the zeitgeist, the generational sorts of trends that are taking place at any given time. And to begin with, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the discovery. Well, actually, before I do that, I want to explain this diagram, if you can see it. This is a kind of a diagram that some astrologers use. It's a derivation. But the planets, Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the Moon, the kind of the intra-Saturnian planets, Saturn on into the Sun, are the more personal planets. Jupiter and Saturn are a bit kind of in between there, but generally speaking, they relate to a more personal sort of energy. And Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are more collective, archetypal, subterranean forces that are almost in the unconscious, the collective unconscious. And so they're way down there and they surface in various ways, but there are some people that believe that they can never become fully conscious. I don't happen to agree with that. But they operate from a much more primal basis than, let's say, the Sun does, or the Mercury, or Venus. And I want to talk for a little bit about the discovery of those three planets, because that was when those energies really became more conscious in the collective. They were already there. If you've read Richard Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche, for example, he talks about when those three planets were conjunct at around 500 BC, when there was this radical sort of shift that took place with religions and global movements, collective movements. So they've always been there. It's just that when they were discovered, it's almost as though those energies came to light in a more conscious, accessible way. So Uranus was discovered in 1781. And you have to look to the period on either side, even though there are things that actually happened in 1781, such as that's really when America was born, because that's when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. That's when the umbilical cord was cut for America from England. So the birth of America is a very profound Uranian symbol in what it represents. Uranus has to do with freedom. It has to do with independence, with revolution, a revolutionary sort of rebellious energy, individualism, for better or worse. It relates to a kind of a higher, a sort of a higher mentality. It's some people call it the higher octave of Mercury, which is somewhat accurate. It relates to a forward-looking sense. Some astrologers like Stephen Arroyo and Richard Tarnas relate Uranus not so much to the mythical Uranus as to Prometheus. And Prometheus is in mythology, it relates to foresight, whereas Epimetheus relates to hindsight. So there's a forward-looking quality to Prometheus, to Uranus. It's a future orientation. And it relates to technology. So at the discovery of Uranus, you had the Industrial Revolution. Around that period, you had the rise of modern democracy. You had the rise of modern capitalism with Adam Smith. And all those things converged into the birth of America, those three trends. And also philosophically, it was a turning point because that was the year, 1781 was the year that Adams, I'm trying to think of the name. Oh, good Lord. It'll come to me. Immanuel Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, which was a major turning point in philosophy. Now, as we go into Neptune, that was 1846 when that was discovered. Now, the interesting thing to me about Neptune is that it was the first truly invisible planet. Uranus is half visible, half invisible. You can see it with the naked eye on a clear night. It's not always that easy to see, but you can see it. Maybe not from around these parts, but I have been able to see it if you know exactly where to look. Certainly with binoculars you can see it. But Neptune is totally invisible. You need a telescope to see it, or a time exposure type of camera. And that symbolizes, in a sense, something deeper in the psyche. It's a more unconscious sort of force. It relates on a symbolic level to a sense of social conscience. You had this worldwide movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s about social issues. You even see that in some of Charles Dickens' writings. It was the time when slavery became a major issue, not just in America. The serfs were freed in Russia. And what's the name of the famous book in America that brought slavery to? Does anyone recall what the name of that was? It was around that time.
Novel?
What's that?
Novel?
Yeah.
Uncle Tom's Cabin?
I might be Uncle Tom's Cabin, I'm not sure. But there's a famous book that came out. What's that?
The author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, didn't she write that?
It might be. I can't remember. But there was a famous book. There were several famous publications at that time that brought these social issues to a head. And, but it also, Neptune is a very mystical, very occult sort of energy. And so you had in 1848, just 2 years after Neptune was discovered, the birth of modern spiritualism with the Fox sisters in Hydesville, New York. If you know anything about that period, the whole mediumship sort of movement of the 1800s began in 1848 in upstate New York, when a couple of sisters started having these, supposedly having awarenesses of other spirits and channeling energies from the other side. And it also was around the time of the birth of photography, the 1830s, 1840s, and Neptune relates a lot to that as well. Edgar Allan Poe was very big at that time, by the way. The Raven came out right around the discovery of Uranus. And curiously, Neptune rules the ocean, it rules water, and Moby Dick came out a few years after, 1852. So, and then Pluto was discovered in 1930, and Pluto is a very powerful energy. It's like a higher octave of Mars, you might say. And that was when we were understanding atomic power, but it was also when we were understanding individual power in a somewhat double-edged way. It was the 1930s, of course, is when Hitler came to power in a big way. It's fascism became a very powerful force in the 1930s, as did the criminal underworld. In the 1920s into the 1930s with Al Capone and figures like that. I'll get back to him in just a second. Now, and also, by the way, around the discovery of Pluto, we had all these horror movies coming out. Dracula in 1931, Frankenstein, The Wolfman, all this. King Kong came out in 1933. It's almost as though all this subterranean energy was welling up into the consciousness. Now, how your individual chart connects to those 3 planets says a lot about which channel on the collective radio station you're attuned to, so to speak. In other words, some people have a very strong connection to Uranus, some to Neptune, some to Pluto, some to all 3. But that tells you right there a great deal about an individual, let's say whether they're historical or yourself, an individual's connection to that zeitgeist, to that generational stream. So take, for example, Ben Franklin had what we call Mercury opposing Uranus, and so he had that real strong sense of innovation, of social change. He was a revolutionary. You know, all those founding fathers and mothers could have been hung. You know, it was a very risky thing. They were radicals of their time. But he also, the famous image of Franklin with the kite and the storm with the lightning, you know, the modern Prometheus he was sometimes called, which is a funny coincidence, and bringing fire down from on high. I mean, it's a perfect image for that kind of energy. Or you take someone like Walt Disney, who was born with his sun aligned, not exactly, but close to his Uranus. And he was this media mogul. Uranus rules media, it rules technology, it rules inventions, it rules a futuristic sensibility. And if you look at Epcot Center, for example, you know, he was very much into that kind of futuristic sense of pushing the envelope. For better or worse is not my point here. I'm just trying to say he was definitely not into just looking back to the past. He was into that kind of forward-looking Uranian energy. Or you take Yoko Ono, the wife of the deceased Beatle John Lennon, who had, I think it was a Uranus squaring Venus, and so she expressed that Uranus energy through her art, through performance art, using media as her artistic medium, and so on. So how a planet like that connects to your chart shows the area. That, let's say if it's Mercury, it's through, and wasn't Ben Franklin, I think he also came up with the Postal Service in America, if I'm right, tons of inventions. So you get an understanding of how someone is connected through which planet is related to that particular generational stream, mind stream. Now we get to Neptune and we see individuals who have a strong connection to Neptune, like musicians in particular. Like Sting has his moon closely conjunct Neptune, and so his emotions are strongly linked to that sort of aesthetic generational stream. Or you take Joni Mitchell, who's got her Venus conjuncting Neptune, so there again the artistic sort of connection to that. Obama has, again I'm not taking sides here, I just want to say Obama has a Sun square Neptune. And so there is a sense there of the social change, though there's also a strong Aquarius and a strong Uranus in his chart, so it's not always just one particular mind stream versus another. Carl Jung was also a Leo who had a Neptune squaring Sun, by the way, like Obama. Although from the other end, the Neptune was in the opposite sign. It wasn't the exact same square. But again, Carl Jung's father was, I believe, a pastor. And Jung brought a spiritual side to psychology that Freud definitely didn't have. Whereas Freud, now that actually is a nice segue here, Freud had a very strong Pluto. He had it right, if the birth time is accurate, he had Pluto right on the 7th house, either in the 7th house or right on the 7th house cusp. So he was connected to that very primal sort of power energy, the sexuality that you see with Pluto. Al Capone had a very strong Pluto. He was connected to the underworld in more ways than one. And I believe it was a Venus conjuncting Pluto. He was also known to frequent prostitutes. And so there's that, you know, again, the underworld, the criminal side of things in terms of what is not more or less considered acceptable by polite society, the shadow energy. Mick Jagger has one heck of a strong Pluto. He's got a stellium with Sun, Pluto, Mercury, and Jupiter together. And so he expresses an energy that's very different from, let's say, what you saw the Beatles with John Lennon and Paul McCartney. More of that primal sort of energy. A funny coincidence, a friend of mine did a chart for a woman a few years ago who was a well-known sex therapist. And he asked my opinion of his chart, because we sometimes, compare charts and try to get each other's opinions on things. And I looked at this chart and it looked awfully familiar, and then I realized it was essentially Mick Jagger's horoscope. And she had been born like a day before Mick Jagger. And she was very well known in her field, and it's not, you know, too surprising what her particular, you know, specialty is. Hitler had a very strong Pluto. It was, I believe it was in conjuncting his moon, and there, people that have a very strong Pluto, like Mick Jagger or Hitler, not to compare the two, or Freud, they often have an ability to kind of tap into some very primal collective energy, for better or worse. You know, if you see a personal planet related to Pluto in the horoscope, you'll often see this connection to things that other people. Prince is another, the singer. He has, I believe, Pluto opposing Moon. So again, people that have that ability to kind of tap into it, for better or worse. Any questions before I go on? I'm throwing a lot of data. You may not know the terms, but yeah.
Jim Morrison of the Doors?
Well, Jim Morris is an interesting case because he was a Sagittarius, but he had a strong Scorpio. And I forget what the Pluto is in his chart, but he's like the embodiment of a Pluto-Scorpio sort of thing. So he definitely, you know, fits into that category. I really should look that up in terms of where his Pluto is, because there's no question that that's really strong in his chart. About Neptune, I almost forgot to mention, by the way, some other good examples of Neptune. Elizabeth Taylor, Johnny Cash, and who was the other one? Ted Kennedy were all born, I think, within about 24 or 48 hours of each other. And they all expressed different parts of that Neptune. They all had, I believe, Sun opposing Neptune. This is going back years. I'm just trying to recall this. But what's fascinating about that is that Liz Taylor expressed it in terms of, on the positive side, the glamour and the fantasy and the filmmaking, although the negative side, she struggled with drugs her whole life, as did all three of those people, by the way. You know, which is fascinating with the Sun opposing Neptune. And you had, and of course, the famous Neptune Sun, you often see this thing with there's a problem with reputation having to do with, it could be a gossipy thing, it could be a scandal, and you had Ted Kennedy with water, you know, somebody goes off into the water. Same weekend as we landed on the moon, by the way, which is an interesting synchronicity. Any other questions before I go on here? Yes?
You know, you're talking about all these, you know, connection to these planets, but what criteria do you use to determine what connection to what planet they have? What's the criteria?
When you look at the horoscope, you'll see whether there's like a personal planet connected to those outer planets. So for example, like in the case of Ben Franklin, if you look at his chart, you'll see that his Mercury is in close alignment to Uranus. Or if you talk about...
What is it, his birthday? Or?
You go by the birthday, yeah. I mean, I shouldn't assume that that's all clear up front.
I have no clue of what it is.
In other words, you draw up the horoscope for the exact time and the date and the place, and you don't even need to know in some of these cases, you don't always need to know the time of day. Even just knowing the date will sometimes give you the information. In the case of someone like Freud, you do need to know the exact time because his Pluto was right on the angle, and that's a technical term. So if you study the horoscope, you'll see how those planets are connected to your own individual planets. I might be, if we have time, I might be able to show you an example of that later on, of a specific sort of chart pattern like that. Any other questions? Okay. Now, this is the first level. The other thing you can do with this is look at the patterns that these form to one another. In other words, the zeitgeist is comprised of, yes, how these are amplified, but it's almost like these are notes, and how they come together determine the music. In other words, Uranus can be aligned with Pluto in a certain way. Neptune can be aligned with Uranus in a certain way. And at any given time in history, you'll see those planets coming together in some fashion that will determine what that global energy is at that time, what the zeitgeist is. So I'm going to go through a few examples of this here. Like in the 1790s, we had Uranus opposing Pluto. And that's when we had the French Revolution and the let them eat cake sort of energy. Uranus has a lot to do with the masses. It has a lot to do with the ordinary population. Pluto is, you might say, the plutocrats, and when you have them at odds with one another, you often see this battle between the upper and lower classes. That's the same thing we have going on right now, by the way. I'll get to that at the end of our talk tonight. That's again, the mutiny on the Bounty and the French Revolution both expressed that sort of Uranus-Pluto sort of tension. We come into 1821 and we have, during the period, and these are just exact dates in some of these cases, you have to look for several years on either side of these. 1821 was when Uranus conjuncted Neptune, which is a fairly spiritual sort of energy. You see a lot of emphasis on the Romantic poets at that time. You also see Beethoven's Ninth Symphony coming out around that time, which expressed this very idealistic image, the brotherhood of mankind sort of thing. We move up there a little bit to 1892. Now this one is particularly important because 1892 is when Neptune and Pluto came together. They only come together every 500 years. So that makes it especially important, and that was a major turning point, 1892, 1893 in that ballpark, starting really in the late 1880s, going up into the early 1890s. That was when the Secret Doctrine came out, around 1888 or 1889. You had the Golden Dawn in the 1890s. We had the Parliament of World Religions in 1893. We had a revolution in music through Debussy. You see the dark side and the light side of these energies. In the late 1890s, you had the story Dracula came out, which expressed the underworld qualities of Pluto and the mystical sort of otherworldly qualities of Neptune and the parasitical qualities of Neptune. It was also the decade that saw the Jack the Ripper tragedy, as well as the one that happened here, the H.H. Holmes in South Chicago. The White Devil, what was it? In the White City, which now one of the theories is that he was Jack the Ripper because he was supposedly in England at the time that took place, which is an interesting theory. We come up here to 1939 to 1943, which is when Uranus formed a very harmonious aspect to Neptune. And that was really considered by many film critics to be this, the golden age of film, with, especially in 1939. And you see a lot of musicians being born. Then I'm going to get to some of the musical talents here in a little bit that were born during that period. But movies like Citizen Kane, Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath. We come up to 1965 to 1966. That's when Uranus and Pluto formed a conjunction, which hadn't happened that happens every, I think it's about 150 years. That again is similar to the French Revolution in terms of social upheaval, in terms of people power is a very strong motif. You see every one of these has a good and a bad side, you might say. It's not all good, it's not all bad. And so that was a period. I remember that period pretty well in terms of the sense of, you know, what's going to happen next. It was a very volatile, explosive time, and yet it was an exciting time. The Beatles and Dylan did their greatest stuff in 65, 66, and 67. You know, Sgt. Pepper, Rubber Soul, Help, Revolver, and Dylan did his three greatest albums, arguably, in 65 and 66. We come in, and also a time of scientific breakthroughs as well in the mid-60s. 1993, that was when Uranus and Neptune came together. They hadn't been together since 1821. And that was the year that the Hubble telescope became activated. They had launched the Hubble telescope under a Mercury retrograde. Now, if you know anything about Mercury retrogrades, every astrologer said this was a mistake, they're going to have problems, and it took them several years to fix the Hubble telescope. But it went active exactly when it should have, in a way. That's the funny thing about delays. It's almost as though they seem to lead to the right timing. And the internet really began in terms of exploded into public consciousness. I remember this clearly in 1994. And the second Parliament of World Religions was in 1993 that we were heavily involved with here. It was an exciting time. And when I was working for the Quest magazine, and there were a lot of exciting new publications coming out, such as Gnosis magazine. Now, the editor of that is now working in my old job, in a way, at the Quest magazine, Richard Smoley. And Quest magazine and Gnosis really kind of peaked during the period of that Uranus-Neptune aspect. But a lot of very spiritually oriented magazines came out around that time, like Tricycle and Common Boundary and Intuition, and on it goes, Magical Blend. So there were a lot of things that were going on then that had to do with this sense of an expanding spirituality and awareness of spirituality. Also, world music became very big during that period. We're talking about the late 1980s up through the early 1990s, Dead Can Dance, Enya, etc. Now we come up to a really interesting one here in 2001. That was a powerful year. 9/11 happened in 2001, obviously. And that was the year that Saturn opposed Pluto. Now, you don't have to necessarily know the meaning of all these planets, but I'll try to explain them a little bit. Saturn is a somewhat constrictive force. It's not an outer planet, but it's on the border there. And when Saturn and Pluto come together, it tends to be a very heavy sort of energy when old structures are torn down and new structures are put up. And what happened that year was, Saturn opposed Pluto. I was working for the Mountain Astrologer then, and we published an article right before 9/11 that kind of forecast that there could be some very heavy developments coming up. And it even seemed to, an article that Robert Hand wrote for us seemed almost to predict what happened in a way. And Saturn was in Gemini. Saturn rules structures, and it was the sign of the twins. Okay, and we had the twin towers go down as a result of Pluto was in Sag, which is religious extremist, you might say. It was an exquisite, well, not exquisite, but it was a stunning expression of Pluto and Sag opposing the twin energies, okay? So sometimes these sorts of configurations can be quite uncanny in the symbolism. Another example of that, by the way, in terms of the symbolism, the multivalent quality of the symbols, in 1971, Saturn opposed Neptune. Neptune has to do with water, it has to do with the dissolution factor. And it was opposing Saturn, which rules boundaries, it rules borders, it rules walls, gates. And that was the year that Watergate happened. Watergate, it's a perfect symbol for Saturn and Neptune. But it's also the year that Led Zeppelin came out with a song called When the Levee Breaks. And the next time Saturn opposed Neptune came around 2005, the levee broke in New Orleans. And so you'll see these weird sorts of synchronicities that happen. In 1989, Saturn conjuncted Neptune. Again, Saturn is walls, it's boundaries, and Neptune is this erosional sort of force, for better or worse. And that was the year that the Berlin Wall, in fact, that was the same week that Saturn conjuncted Neptune was the same week that the Berlin Wall came down. You saw this wall crumbling right when Neptune came up to conjunct Saturn. It's as to an astrologer, it's really astonishing, the symbolism, how that plays out. Now, I want to go over some examples here of like individuals and how people that are born during these powerful times plug into the zeitgeist. They're tuned into the zeitgeist, because it's one thing to see these patterns happen in the culture. It's another thing when you see people that incarnate, you might say, on the waves of these energies. They're riding the waves of planetary change in a very profound way. And I want to go over some, I think, interesting examples of that. So, for instance, if we take 1892, that was an especially powerful time, and we see a lot of very powerful individuals being born at this once every 500-year pattern. We saw Dwight Eisenhower, we saw Tolkien, whose stories are now coming out all over the place in terms of The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit movie coming out this year. We had Yogananda born during, I don't mean necessarily right on the year, but in the early 1890s and the late 1880s. Hitler and Chaplin were born the same week, 4 days apart from one another in, I think it was 1888. And they look the same. I mean, if you caricatured each one, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference other than the bowler hat and the outfit, because they have the same little mustache. But one represents, you might say, the ultimate good. The other represents the ultimate bad, in a way. It's a curious polarity of how they related to the energies. We'll come back to that point in a little bit. We also had de Gaulle born in around that time. Chairman Mao was born around that time. So that was a Buckminster Fuller, born in the early 1890s. So that was one of those periods when a lot of very powerful souls came in, for better or worse. One of the yogis I studied for many years with Goswami Kriyananda in the city, and then I studied with his teacher for quite a long time, Shelley Trimmer, who was a man who studied with Yogananda in the early 40s. And they used to say that the great souls, take it for what it's worth, the great souls wait for those opportune times to incarnate. You know, Einstein wouldn't necessarily incarnate into a Stone Age tribe. I mean, unless he's a bodhisattva and he wants to teach them, you know. But you're gonna gravitate towards those places where you can develop your talents or your skills or your spirituality. And so Kriyananda used to make the comment that the great souls wait for those very special times, like Pericles' Athens or the period of the Founding Fathers. Actually, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. We had in 1769 and 1770, let me make sure I have the dating on that right. Yeah. We had a very unusual thing happen with the outer three planets forming a triangle to one another. Now, to an astrologer, you know that's what we call a grand trine, and that's an unusual. This very rarely happens. You know, it's not even hundreds of years. It's usually thousands of years that those three planets come into that sort of alignment. Two individuals that were born right in, they plugged right into that with their personal planets linked to those points. Beethoven had his, if I remember correctly, his Jupiter and his Venus kind of sandwiching that Pluto. And Napoleon had his Mars aligned with that Neptune. And they had a weird symbiosis of destinies. You had, which symphony was it that Beethoven dedicated to?
Oh, I don't know.
Beethoven dedicated, I think, his Third Symphony to Napoleon, and then he wound up, you know, scratching that off because he didn't like what he did. So, I mean, again, these energies, you know, here you normally think of a trine as being a good energy in traditional astrology, but again, Beethoven and Napoleon are polar opposites in terms of what they did for the world. Any questions before I go on here? I might grab some water. Did you have a question?
I do, but I think I want to wait because I want to see if it'll.
No, I'm curious.
Okay, well, because here's the thing. I don't know about the rest of you, but I always had a little bit of a skeptic. And my mother's an
That's fine.
astrologer, so I was raised. So and I love the synchronicities that you're pointing out, and I think it's very important. But I'm wondering, what about those people that were born that had these same, whatever in their charts that didn't become famous? I mean,
Oh yeah.
what would be happening to them? And you know, could anybody just be plugged in here?
Yeah, I mean, I've done, yes.
I'm trying to figure out why these particular people, and is it really?
No, it's a good question. It's not as though these patterns make you famous. It might be, for example, someone might be born with a strong connection to Pluto the same day as Dwight Eisenhower, and it might manifest for them as simply an interest in that area that Eisenhower became famous in. In other words, these things don't ensure fame. They merely show a kind of an archetypal orientation. And if in the case of, take for example, Yogananda. Yogananda was born when in 1892, I believe, when Neptune and Pluto were conjunct, when that once every 500-year planet pattern came up. But he was born with it at the very top of his chart in the 10th house. So that brought it into more prominence, whereas someone born a few hours later, it wouldn't be out there. Now, there were probably, you know, lots of people born the same minute as Yogananda on the planet with that up in the same spot. But again, it doesn't have to be a fame sort of thing. That's going to be the rarity, but there's going to be a commonality. In the same way that I've done charts for people born, I did a chart recently for someone that was born the same day as the writer David Foster Wallace, who's a very brilliant writer that killed himself a few years ago, something like February 20th, 1962. And this is a guy that did not become a famous or a great writer, but there were definite similarities in their lives and their personalities. So it's, you know, it's a commonality at a deeper level, not necessarily in terms of the superficials of their outer life. I don't know if that's answering your question or not.
I think so. I think
Okay,
it's-
well,
I'm just trying to figure out what that one factor is then that would allow some of these people to change the world and others with this, you know, identically similar, or whatever word you want to use, charts, didn't do anything to change.
There are some things that can show why one person does be, like I said, if it's high on the chart, you know, that can show it. And sometimes I think the chart does not show everything. There are things that the horoscope does not show. You cannot tell. Shelley, the teacher that I studied with in Florida, he said you cannot tell a person's level of spirituality from the horoscope, because that's an element of free will that you bring to the horoscope. Did you have a question?
Would that have,
Don't give me that.
this is my karma. Thank you. I've been watching from downstairs. Would that have something to do with the evolution of the soul of the person? You know, perhaps Yogananda or whoever remarkable individual in humanity, you know, had this dharma to fulfill, and the other person who incarnated at the same time under the same conditions and all didn't fulfill as much. Would that have something to do with the evolution?
Absolutely. And another example that I forgot that I'll mention is, and I think I used this in The Waking Dream, you'll have a cow born at the same minute as, let's say, you know, Jesus Christ or Dwight Eisenhower or whatever, and they have the exact same horoscope. They might even be born a few feet apart from each other, you know, on a given day on a farm, for example. But that cow is not going to go on to fame or whatever because it doesn't have the intrinsic karma, shall we say, the intrinsic background. So again, you bring to your horoscope a whole boatload of energy that is not there in the horoscope itself. So I hope that, you know, explains it a little bit more. Another example would be John Lennon and Bob Dylan were born during a very powerful time in late around 1940 for John Lennon, 1941 for Bob Dylan. There's a very strange example. I want to get to this one here. In the early 1930s, you had an alignment. You had a Uranus square Pluto similar to what you have now, but it was also Saturn thrown into that mix. And we just had those same three planets in a very difficult configuration a few years ago, and we now have this Uranus-Pluto coming to a head. That's that social turmoil, social unrest energy. And some of the people that were born then, James Dean was one. He had his Uranus right on his ascendant. Similar, by the way, to what Kurt Cobain had in 1965 or 66. His Uranus was right on the ascendant, so he was plugged into that sort of revolutionary energy, rebel without a cause in James Dean case. But we also had Marshall Applewhite born the same week as Jim Jones. Marshall Applewhite, as you might recall, was that cult leader, the Heaven's Gate cult leader from 1997, where he had his followers kill themselves. And that guy was born the same week as Jim Jones, like I think 3 days later or something like that as you know, Jim Jones. And you know, heavy energy. And I looked at Charles Manson, and he came in at the tail end of this energy, he was born in 1934, so that was a little bit later, but he did have that Uranus-Pluto. And they're all, interesting thing about all those characters, James Dean, Marshall Applewhite, Jim Jones, and Charles Manson, they all had like this cult veneration around them. And even in the case of James Dean, there was death surrounding him in the sense of, I don't mean just his own death, but I remember reading an article years ago about people killing themselves, you know, to emulate James Dean dying at a young age. People forget about that now. They followed him in the same way I suppose people followed Jim Jones and Marshall Applewhite. There's another figure born in 1931, I'm almost wary of pointing this out, but Rupert Murdoch. You make of that what you will. Now, but we have this energy right now. We have this very powerful energy happening with those two planets. Uranus and Pluto, the same one we had back in the 1790s, though a different pattern. It was what we call an opposition, 180-degree angle in 1890s. Then in the early 1930s, we had Uranus squaring Pluto, that revolutionary energy. And we could also talk about the changes that FDR made and how similar they are to what's going on now. You look back at, for better or worse, I'm not taking sides here, but if you look back at the articles in the newspaper editorials that were written in the early 1930s about FDR, they're calling him a socialist. They were angry at his immigration policy. It was quite similar to what we have happening now. And he was against the banks, or at least it seemed like he was. And again, we have the similar problem with the banks now. Now it's a little hard to say to what degree our government is fighting that. But this energy, the Uranus squaring the Pluto, which is a 90-degree angle, the way that we would indicate this as astrologers would be that. It's a 90-degree angle there, and that's coming to a head in a very short while, in a few weeks. It's going to be triggering 7 times over the next few years, actually more than that, because if you include the station points and the secondary trigger, it's like when the smaller planets cross over those points. And astrologers are waiting with bated breath to wait to see what this is going to bring, because it's already been shaking things up in a big way. And you can look back to the 60s, for example, to get a sense of what to expect this time. In the mid-1960s, we had that people power, social unrest. We had the violence, unfortunately, riots in the streets. We had the riots in, not riots, but explosions in the form of the war in Vietnam. There were more explosives, I guess, in the Vietnam War than there had been in any of the previous world wars. I think that's what Rick Tarnas once said about that. And it also was a time of the sexual revolution, and now we have this whole thing with gay marriage, the controversy over that. There are a lot of similarities between what happened then and what's happening now. But there's a lot of good to these energies too, and I just wrote an article that'll be coming out in a couple of months in Mountain Astrologer called Uranus Square Pluto Breakdown or Breakthrough, because there's a lot of astrologers that are kind of tying this to the 2012 hysteria and trying to say that it's going to be kind of a society being turned upside down or other such things, which I don't happen to agree with at all. But there's a lot of positive that can come with this sort of pattern. In the mid-60s, we had major scientific breakthroughs. In the mid-60s, such as Bell's theorem, or we had John Wheeler coined the term black hole. We had fractals really developing as a major sort of scientific idea through Mandelbrot. In spirituality, the Beatles went to India in the 60s, and that brought Hindu philosophy and yoga to the West in a way that it hadn't seen before. You had, in the arts, you had some pretty major, well, look at media. Media is considered a wasteland, but I remember TV shows like Twilight Zone and Outer Limits and things like that, which are quite thought-provoking for their time and still stand up in some ways. Don't forget, too, that Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick under a very similar pattern back in 1851 and 1852. So there's a lot of creative potential when you have this much energy surging up, like happened in the 60s. Yeah, on the one hand, the 60s gave us the Beatles and Dylan and all these things. It also gave us Charles Manson and Altamont. So this can go either way. It all depends on what people do with it. I want to emphasize the free will side of this because it's similar to the example of Hitler and Chaplin. Why is it that these two individuals that had extremely similar horoscopes took them in radically different directions? It's because the karma was different. The spirituality behind them, if that's the right word, was different. And so right now we're coming into a period when it can cause people to react in a very volatile way where they get into arguments and fight either verbally or physically. It can be a time of actual physical violence or riots. It'll be interesting to see what happens this weekend with the NATO summit here in Chicago. The Uranus-Pluto energy is coming to a head in the end of June. Watch the end of June very closely because you not only have this energy coming to a head then, you've got the Saturn station point, which is another major trigger. Two major triggers happening within days of each other. So the last 10 days of June is going to be probably very intense. But it's up to the individual in terms of, are you going to get sucked into the volatile side of it, or are you going to use it in some kind of creative fashion? Whenever these energies happen, there's almost this welling up of subterranean forces. And you know, I remember seeing a TV show on Iceland, I think it was, where that showed these volcanic vents that were harnessing the energy from these volcanic vents for creative, constructive purposes. You know, some people can get burned on those volcanic vents, the steam that comes up, or you can channel that towards some constructive outlet. And that's exactly what we're faced with here in terms of what's coming up now. And this energy is going to be firing 7 times over the next 3 years or so. And it's going to hit everybody's horoscope a little bit differently. It's going to be a little more easy for some individuals than others. That's a given. But in any event, no matter how it hits you, it's something you can channel in a constructive way if you want. Now, how are we on time, by the way? When are we scheduled to go to?
We're until 8:30 with questions.
With questions, that includes questions? Okay. I have some more to say, but let me ask, I want to leave plenty of time for questions if anybody has any. Yes? Yeah.
Please wait for the microphone.
Okay.
And I will bring it to you. We have a question from online.
Sorry for the squeaky.
There is a transit of Venus this year. How might it influence the Earth?
Well, there's always a transit of Venus. I'm not sure. I know there's a transit of Venus over the Sun coming up. I believe it's in June 5th or something like that. And some people relate that even to the Mayan prophecy and all this. I frankly don't know how important that is. That's not something I've paid attention to. I don't see that as a particularly negative energy, so I don't see it as being some people. I saw something on YouTube a few days ago where some people were trying to relate that to, some apocalyptic sort of thing, and there's too much of that talk going around, unfortunately. That's the best I can really say about that. Another question?
Another question. Were Mark Twain and Edison symbols of light? It seems like they were in the same time period.
Edison was an Aquarius. I forget what Twain was. I used to know his chart, but Edison had a really interesting, all these inventors seem to be Aquarians. It's kind of funny. I don't know. I think they knew each other, but I don't know much about if they had a connection or what their horoscopes are in terms of similar in any fashion. So I can't really answer that as well as I'd like. Was there another hand was going up around here? No.
What about the solar eclipse?
Oh, the solar eclipse this Sunday. There is a solar eclipse this Sunday. And it's at 0 degrees of Gemini. And these things hit everybody differently. For some people, they'll experience them in a more kind of constructive fashion. For other people, it'll be more of a kind of a challenging energy. So you really need to see the whole horoscope. But eclipses tend to indicate a shift, a change. It's like a super duper new moon, to use a very non-technical term. A new moon, when the sun and the moon come together, it signifies a shift, a kind of a new cycle beginning. And when you have the sun and the moon exactly together, that's an eclipse. That's where the one actually blocks out the other. So think of it as like a new beginning, but it tends to kind of upset the old order a little bit insofar as where you see it fall in your horoscope, and this is getting a little technical, I realize, but where you see the eclipse fall in your horoscope tends to show where you're going to have a major shift take place. So like if you have an eclipse in the 7th house, it shows somehow a change in the status of a partnership in your life. If you have a change, if the eclipse falls in your 2nd house, it might be a change in your finances or your money earning ability. So it really does hinge on, well, as a general sort of rule, eclipses, this one's in Gemini, it could be, I really would need to study that a little more before I try to predict anything on that. But there's a lot of stuff on the internet about that, about this upcoming eclipse. And we just had a Venus retrograde a few days ago. on Tuesday morning, Venus went retrograde right around the time that Jamie Dimon of, J.P. Morgan, it turns out that there was this big financial reverberation in the market. The timing of that was, I thought, quite fitting. So any other questions? Okay, yeah?
What other kinds of things would that Venus retrograde affect?
You have to, if on a personal level, you have to see how it's aspecting what we call aspecting in your individual planet. So for example, if you see someone, I believe it's around 23 degrees of, is it Gemini? The Venus went retrograde. And if it's forming a square to someone's difficult, a challenging relationship to somebody's Saturn, that's going to be very different than someone who has it conjuncting their Jupiter. So I'm a little hesitant to make a generalized sort of prediction, a statement about that. It depends on your individual horoscope and where it falls. But in general, they say that under Venus retrograde might not be the best time to initiate major new developments in terms of finances, purchases. I mean, those are kind of the old school ways of looking at it, though on a deeper spiritual level, it often has to do with an internalizing of people's heart energies. It's almost like, it's particularly good for meditation. I've seen a lot of spiritual teachers that have Venus retrograde in their birth chart. And a lot of musicians, interestingly enough. You know, there's something about the retrograde energy which has a bad reputation, but it actually can be an introverted sort of reflection that can be very positive. So, any other questions? I wanted to mention, I thought, a really interesting synchronicity here about in terms of people born in the mid-60s, people that are born during these very powerful times tend to have not necessarily a better or a worse impact. That all depends on the individual, but a more lasting, powerful impact once they do something, like I mentioned the example of Hitler and Chaplin. And in 1965 is when J.K. Rowling was born. And the lead character in the Harry Potter story has a lightning bolt kind of mark on the forehead, which is a very Uranian sort of thing. But two other individuals born during this period, Larry Wachowski, now Lana Wachowski, and Andy Wachowski. Lana was born in 1965 and Andy was born in 1967. So they're plugged into that revolutionary sort of energy, and they came out with this mega blockbuster movie trilogy, actually, The Matrix, which if you study the symbolism of that, it's kind of like the individual against the system. Now, they put together this other film called V for Vendetta. And that's about this revolutionary figure. If you haven't seen the film, it's worth seeing. It's a very interesting, somewhat incendiary film. It was pretty nervy of them to come out with it when they did right after 9/11. But it's about this character who's somewhat of an anarchist, that is a subversive figure who's kind of going up against the system, similar to The Matrix in that respect. And the Wachowskis wrote the script based on an Alan Moore graphic novel, and they produced the movie. And now what I find interesting is that they were born under the Uranus squaring the Pluto, the Uranus conjunct the Pluto in the mid-1960s. And now that those two planets are moving into a 90-degree alignment, what do you see in the newspaper and online virtually every single day? It's the V mask, the character from the movie V for Vendetta, splashed all over the world now in terms of marches that are coming out. So they were plugged into that energy, and now it's coming back in. And the seeds were planted when they were born, you might say, and now that that energy is moving into a square formation, we see the symbolism bursting out into the public in terms of almost like the story coming true that they produced the movie for. Some other things that might come up the next few years in terms of some general predictions. In the same way that we saw major breakthroughs in the 60s, politically, scientifically, in terms of media, spiritually, in terms of people becoming aware of Eastern religions to a greater degree. I think that we could see some major breakthroughs in science the next few years. It might have to do with the so-called God particle. There's increasing support for the holographic universe idea from respected scientists, which is quite interesting. Are we going to discover other dimensions? That's one of the things that keeps coming up in the alternative sort of scientific field. Could it be that we're going to finally make contact with extraterrestrials? You know, that's a possibility. There's scientists that are hard at work at that, not just people on the fringe, in terms of SETI, in terms of various efforts, you know, to try to find life in outer space. You know, are we going to contact them, or are they going to contact us? We might see some major breakthroughs in archaeology. There's an archaeological site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. You might have heard of it. And it's, you can look that up, Göbekli, I believe. And it's a revolutionary discovery. It actually was discovered, synchronistically enough, I suppose, in the mid-60s, the site itself. But it's now coming out that this is a site more advanced in some ways than Stonehenge, but it goes back 12,000 years, and that's long before anyone thought that these monumental structures really could have been built or erected, because that takes a level of social organization that simply didn't believe existed in the time of so-called hunters and gatherers. So we may see some major stuff with that. I think it's very possible we'll see some breakthroughs in Egyptology if they finally really, that's something I've been involved with over the years quite a bit through John Anthony West and Boris Said. And there's a lot yet to be discovered in Egypt, including inside the pyramid. And I don't know if they're ever going to find anything under the Sphinx. I think I don't think that's going to happen, but I think there's a very good possibility of major discoveries involving the pyramids, such as in what they call the Gattenbrink shaft. We'll see. In the arts, in the same way that the mid-60s was a time when there was amazing music coming out on a popular level, certainly, with like the Beatles and Dylan and various artists like that, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, Neil Young. It's possible we may see some major breakthroughs in terms of brilliant artists and musicians coming out. It's worth looking at this film coming out in a few weeks, almost right on target with the Uranus-Pluto of the movie Prometheus, which is quite uncanny too because of the symbolism of how Prometheus is related with by some astrologers to Uranus. And it's a Ridley Scott movie that's basically a takeoff on, it's a riff on the Alien franchise. But Ridley Scott is a brilliant director, and the trailers look pretty astonishing, so that could be some interesting reflection of what's coming up here. There also, I honestly believe there could be major discoveries the next 2 or 3 years having to do with new branches on the human family tree. In the last few years, we've seen the hobbit in Indonesia, which you may not, hobbit, Homo florensis, however it's pronounced. There was a new species of human that was discovered in the last few years. The fossil record, it wasn't a living creature. Well, you know, these creatures may still be out there. We haven't explored every square inch of the planet. And in fact, the hobbit humanoid in Indonesia, someone looked at the skeleton and compared it to Lucy, the famous fossil in Africa. And they were essentially identical. And that was an interesting correlation somebody drew. And there have been sightings of small, creatures, small humanoid-type creatures in that part of the world, down in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. There was a new race of humans, fossilized remnants of a previously unknown race of humanoids in China called the Red Deer Cave people. And that's just in the last 5 years or so. So I think that we could see more of those sorts of things happen. There could be major breakthroughs in terms of our understanding of, the family tree. Any other questions? Yeah.
What about spiritually? Oh, I'm so sorry. You know me. What about spiritually? I mean, I think that there's a really strong trend of the feminine coming out in
Yeah.
religion, and do you see that, and where do you see that going?
I think that's been building up a head of steam for a long time, but I think that that gets stronger at certain points, and this is one of those points. It's a big issue right now in terms of, well, for example, Pluto's, this is getting a little technical, I'll try to make it, simple, but Pluto's in Capricorn right now, opposing the United States Cancer planets. Cancer relates to the feminine, to mothering, to the maternal instinct, etc. So we see in our political battles right now a lot of emphasis on women, on the war against women, that sort of thing. So I think that that's bringing to a head a lot of these issues and equal pay sorts of issues. So I think that's going to be an ongoing battle for some time, but I think that is one of the things that's going to come to a head during the next few years, as well as civil rights, gay marriage. Any kind of lingering issues beneath the surface, I think, get pushed to the surface by these sorts of volatile energies. But on a spiritual level, I really do think that whenever you have these very powerful planets coming together, it's a time when you see a much more intense thrust towards spiritual teachings, towards spiritual teachers, as well as possible scandals with those things. It brings out the best and the worst. You look back at history at each of these points and you see for every great thing that appears, you see something not so great. Like I said, in the 1890s, for example, you had, and that was also the birth of filmmaking, by the way, in the 1890s. You had teachers like Yogananda being born in the Parliament of World Religions, but you also had Jack the Ripper. It's never simple, unfortunately. It's never all one or the other. There's usually some kind of conflict around these things. Any other questions? Yeah.
What do you think about, they say about the Maya calendar, that in December 21st,
Right.
something's going to happen, then a Vero planet or something like that going to hit the earth?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of the 2012 thing. I don't know enough about Mayan astrology, but I do think it's worth mentioning that it is somewhat synchronistic that it's happening the same year as the Uranus squaring the Pluto, which is a very upheaval sort of energy. And so there's bound to be upheavals and social unrest and major breakthroughs or changes the next few years, and maybe this year in particular. If only because of the Uranus-Pluto. How much of that might be because of the Mayan calendar? I'm not entirely convinced we understand the Mayan calendar well enough to know what it means. That's part of my problem with it. I respect it as a system. It's an interesting system, but how well do we really understand it? I don't know. Another time, by the way, to pay very close attention to is September. This is something my friend Dave Gunning pointed out to me, and some of you might know his work. It's in September you have, similar to what's at the end of June, a similar alignment of, there's a Pluto station point around the same time as the Pluto-Uranus coming together. So between the 15th and the 25th of September, that also is one of these volatile times when I think you're going to probably see maybe some unpleasant things, but also possible breakthroughs. And I think there will be some big breakthroughs this year of the sort we're talking about, but pay a special attention, in my opinion, to June and September. And by the way, I believe that the Supreme Court is handing down a ruling on, what is it? Healthcare. Isn't it the middle of the end of June?
Yeah.
So I think whichever way that gets decided, there's going to be huge turmoil. So I think that's part of what we're going to see. I think the Supreme Court ruling is going to be just one of those many things that express that volatile energy at the end of June. Any other questions? Yes, Lydia.
We hear a lot about going beyond the ego,
Yeah,
out of duality into oneness.
right.
And in the human chakra system, of course, going out of the third and up. So where are we going with that, in your opinion?
Well, I'll try to give a short answer to that. You see, and this is getting really esoteric, but I have to go there a little bit. The solar system, you might say, is a reflection of the chakra system. Actually, let's do it vertically. And this is something I've written a lot about, as some of you know this already. You know, the sun relates to the third eye, Mercury relates to the throat chakra, Venus is the heart chakra, Mars is Manipura at the navel center, Jupiter, Guru, is the Svadhisthana, second chakra, and Saturn is the root chakra. And don't ask me about the other 3 planets, it's a little complicated. But the Earth is between Mars and, oh yeah, sorry if you couldn't see that. The Earth is right there between Mars and Venus. So the Earth is, you might say, a classroom that you might compare to 3rd grade, okay? And can you really expect 3rd graders to ever act like college grads? I think that the Earth is a kind of a classroom for a certain kind of lessons that has to do with the movement from Mars, which is the kind of the violent animalistic side, to Venus, the more angelic sort of energies. So we're in between, you know, the devil and the angels, so to speak. But that's where, that's the lessons of this particular planet. And for people to expect the Earth to become like, you know, this paradisial, you know, place where the lion lays down with the lamb, I don't think it's going to happen, because I don't think it was necessarily meant to happen, any more than, let's say, 3rd graders are going to probably fight and get into playground, you know, battles and all this, and that in a sense is the nature. I'm not justifying it. I'm saying that's the nature of the lessons. If someone wants, if they've graduated from those lessons, they're not going to be on this planet unless they come back for bodhisattva reasons. You know, it's, so in terms of transcendence, planet is about the transcendence of the ego, absolutely. But I don't think it's the place where that, it might be where someone graduates to that, but I don't think this is really where that happens. You know, this is where the egoless people congregate. This isn't where they go. This is where they go to get rid of their ego. That's my personal feeling of it.
So do we continue fighting and killing each other?
Well, no, we're not supposed to, but I'm saying those lessons will always be here in perpetuity through history, I mean, through millions of years probably, for those that have that lesson. But when someone's learned those lessons, they move on from here, or they come back to help. But it's to expect all of humanity to rise up to that level, I don't think it's realistic, any more than I don't expect 3rd graders to act like college graduates. You know, it's a different classroom than, let's say, you know, going to Harvard. You know, so that's not an answer that makes anybody very happy, but that's the way I see it. Any other questions? How are we doing on time, by the way? We have a few minutes? Any other questions? Yes?
You know that Mercury's going retrograde on election day.
Yeah.
It did that,
Yeah.
in 2000 or whatever. So I just wondered if you had any comments on that. And I know Saturn's moving into Scorpio right before that. So maybe you might have a comment.
The streets are lined with the bones of astrologers who try to predict elections.
I'm not asking that part, but just, you know.
I know. Well, it's similar to what happened. It's a little bit similar to what happened during the Bush-Gore thing, when there was a difficult Mercury, and it wound up dragging out and just becoming this, you know, legalistic nightmare. And I think that the fact that the election is occurring on that, you know, difficult Mercury shows it could be similar to that. There could be some real problems with either tallying the votes or disagreements over things or inconsistencies. You know, like what happened in the 2004 election, where the exit polls somehow didn't match the actual votes in the computers, you know, in Ohio and places like that. So that's the sort of thing I see with that. I really don't know what to make of the next few years in terms of whoever gets in, whether it's Obama or Romney or whoever, in case something else happens between now and then. It's going to be a pretty volatile time when there's going to be a lot of polarization in the culture. So, any other questions? One more? Okay. I want to mention, just to close here, that I do have a website with a lot of articles on it. It's myname.com, raygrossi.com. So I have some of this material on there, not all of it, but a few of the things, if you want to read up further on it, articles on synchronicity and astrology and that sort of thing, on a certain section of the website. So I want to thank you all for coming.